Committee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, Chair called up H.R. 4471, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to start today? Seeing none, Chair would recognize Mr. Waxman to offer an amendment. Clerk will report the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Which number is your amendment, sir?
Number 3?
Yes. Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendments, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, the Gasoline Regulations Act blocks and delays EPA from finalizing several important air quality rules until after a new government bureaucracy produces a new analysis of these and other EPA actions. But it's a fool's errand, because the new government bureaucracy is required to conduct an impossible analysis of rules that haven't even been proposed using data that doesn't exist. The bill would block EPA from issuing new Tier 3 standards for motor vehicles and fuels to reduce harmful tailpipe emissions that cause smog and deadly particle pollution. Smog and soot pollution can trigger asthma attacks, heart attacks, and even premature death. The bill would block and likely indefinitely delay EPA from issuing long overdue rules to require refineries to use modern technology to reduce their emissions of toxic air pollutants that cause cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and other serious health problems. The bill would also block and likely indefinitely delay EPA from issuing rules necessary for states and localities to implement the 2008 ozone standard. This would leave the outdated and unprotective 1997 ozone standard in place. In addition, the bill would block EPA from updating the ozone standard to reflect the best available science on the health effects of breathing dirty air. During the legislative hearing on this bill, Chairman Whitfield stated, quote, "It is not the intent of this legislation to roll back any existing health protections," end quote. If that's the case, then there should be no objection to my amendment. My amendment states that notwithstanding the bill's provisions, the administrator cannot delay implementing any of the EPA rules laid out in Section 5 of the bill if the air pollution that would be controlled by those rules causes serious harm to human health, including asthma attacks and other respiratory diseases, heart attacks, cancer, birth defects, brain damage, or premature death. The Republicans want to pretend that this bill is not an attack on the Clean Air Act or public health, but that claim is laughable. This bill changes a foundational provision of the Clean Air Act that has been in place since 1970. The change would effectuate the interpretation that industry took all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled against them. Barring EPA from setting air quality standards based on the science is a fundamental and very dangerous weakening of the Clean Air Act. And the bill indisputably prohibits EPA from issuing important rules to reduce air pollution that is harming Americans today. It even has the effect of barring implementation of the current ozone standard. Republicans argue these rules would only be delayed for a while. But this assumes that the interagency committee can actually complete the impossible study required by this bill. And even then, there would still be no deadlines for these rules, as the bill eliminates existing deadlines and sets no new ones. Americans rely on the Environmental Protection Agency to hold polluters responsible for cleaning up their pollution. It's just common sense. If you stop EPA from doing its job, public health will suffer. So let's come clean. If you want to pass a bill to stop EPA from doing its job, And if you want to allow polluters to pollute with impunity, be honest with the American people. Tell them you think that we've done enough to reduce air pollution and that you want to stop further cleanup of air pollution. But just don't pretend that this get-out-of-jail-free card for oil industry polluters won't hurt the health of Americans, and especially our children and the elderly. If, on the other hand, you don't want to block efforts to clean up air pollution that is contributing to asthma attacks, heart attacks, lung disease, cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and premature death, then I would urge support for my amendment. My amendment will make it perfectly clear that EPA can continue to clean up air pollution that causes serious health effects, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with great respect for the gentleman from California, I would speak to oppose his amendment. I would say, first of all, that we certainly do not intend to act with impunity to stop any of these regulations. This legislation is so very simple. As a matter of fact, it's totally consistent with President Obama's Executive Order 13563. As recently as March 2012, the White House issued a memo reiterating that agencies should take active steps to take account of the cumulative effects of new and existing rules. And that's all this legislation does. It asks for an analysis to determine what impact these three regulations, and I recognize they're not final yet, but these three regulations may have on gasoline prices in the future. I think any unbiased American would say there's nothing wrong with that. Why shouldn't we consider the impact, the cumulative impact of a regulation or regulations? What is the cumulative impact that might have on future gasoline prices? And that's all this legislation does. Now, some people have said, well, there is no final rule. And we certainly understand that. But I would like to ask one of our legal counsels just a question about the process over at EPA. It's my understanding that EPA has an action development process that they go through when they develop a regulation. Is that correct?
That's correct. EPA has published an action development plan to develop regulations.
And it's my understanding when they finally get to the point where they're going to make one regulation final, or they're going to submit it to OMB or the Office of Federal Register, that it's frequently 900 to 1,200 pages in analysis. Is that correct?
That is correct. Both the rule language, the preamble language, the analysis, and background documents can be thousands of pages.
And we know for a fact right now on the three regulations that we refer to in this legislation that they've already began meetings about this, meeting with stakeholders, having a thorough analysis conducted already. Is that correct?
According to EPA's websites, the actions have in fact been initiated, and there have been stakeholder outreach meetings.
So I would just say that what we're trying to do is very simple. And we know that there's plenty of evidence already available, analysis already available. It's not going to be that complicated for this task force. And I will admit once again that we do not see that this legislation is going to reduce gasoline prices tomorrow, but we do believe that it can contribute and make us more aware of what these regulations, how they will impact gasoline prices in the future. And that's information that we need to know to protect the American public. So with that, I would simply respectfully request that we defeat the gentleman's amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
You asked the council about analyzing a rule that hasn't even been proposed, but you said if it's been initiated, that's enough. But initiated can mean a variety of things. It can mean that EPA devoted some staff time to collecting the newest scientific data on a topic. It could mean EPA held private meetings with key stakeholders. It could mean EPA has held public meetings to discuss potential approaches with affected communities. So this business of initiated doesn't really tell you what a rule is, and therefore you can't do an analysis on a rule that hasn't been proposed. Initiated does not necessarily mean, however, that EPA has selected a preferred approach. And even where EPA is leaning toward a preferred approach, that often changes in the course of the initial pre-proposal discussions. I want to give you an example of that. The Interior Department just issued proposed rules for disclosure of the contents of hydraulic fracturing fluids used in wells on public lands. During preliminary discussions, the Interior Department indicated that it planned to require drillers to provide a list of chemicals 30 days before commencing drilling. But the Interior Department changed course and proposed a rule that requires drillers to disclose after the fact. The importance of all this is that the bill would stop EPA from acting, and unless there was this extensive analysis that cannot be done on a rule that hasn't been proposed, and therefore it stops any action to protect the public health.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent for 30 seconds to simply respond.
Without objection.
All I would say is that if these regulations become final, then it's too late. All this legislation does is it gives the task force the authority to analyze and make a prediction, give us information on the impact that these regulations may have on gasoline prices. It certainly doesn't, these regulations are going to take a while to develop anyway, but I think it's imperative that we have this information, and I think the American public would like this information. And with that, I guess my 30 seconds have expired.
I was counting. Your 30 seconds is now ended. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to rise to support the ranking member's amendment. The bill really doesn't have anything to do with gasoline prices. In the past, I heard Chairman Whitfield say it won't change gasoline prices tomorrow, but in the past he said there's nothing in the legislation that would in and of itself reduce gasoline prices. Instead, this bill is really a thinly veiled attempt to check off a few more boxes on the oil industry's wish list at the expense of the health of the American people. The oil industry doesn't want to have to clean up the fuels used in motor vehicles. So this bill blocks and delays EPA from issuing new Tier 3 standards to reduce smog and particle pollution. Too bad if this means that the states and localities will need to require other more expensive pollution reductions. Too bad if our communities are unable to achieve healthy air. The oil industry doesn't want to install modern and available pollution control technology at refineries to reduce emissions of toxic air pollutants that cause cancer, brain damage, and other health effects. The Republican solution is to block and indefinitely delay EPA from requiring refiners to use this technology. The oil industry would rather EPA rely on an outdated 15-year-old ozone standard than on a standard rooted in the best available peer-reviewed science on the health impacts of breathing high levels of ozone. So this bill would block and likely indefinitely delay from implementing the most recent ozone standards or updating it until at least 2018. This bill is just one more in a long line of bills passed by this committee to allow industrial sources to continue to pollute despite the availability of cost-effective, proven emissions controls. You know, our committee has amassed an embarrassing record. This committee has voted to let dirty power plants off the hook, boilers, cement kilns, industrial mining facilities, offshore drilling operations, and now we have a bill before us to delay several additional EPA air quality rules under the guise of protecting consumers from high gasoline prices. My colleague's amendment, the ranking member's amendment, simply states that the bill will not delay EPA action to finalize these air quality rules if the rules reduce pollution that causes asthma attacks, heart attacks, cancer, brain damage, birth defects, and other serious health problems. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentlelady, yield to me?
Yes.
If you're finished.
Be pleased to yield.
With your comment. Let me just, because I think it's important to understand this business of initiate. because the bill says if EPA is initiating a rule, therefore it's stopped from moving forward on that rule, while a new bureaucracy, an interagency task force, will now analyze that rule, but there's no rule. So we don't know what they're analyzing. But meanwhile, EPA cannot go forward with anything. And the issue is, this interagency committee, this new bureaucracy, what would they analyze? They wouldn't know what sources would be covered by a potential rule. They wouldn't know the emission limits. They wouldn't know the most efficient technology options available to covered sources. They wouldn't know a compliance schedule. Just because EPA has started discussing the framework for a new air quality rule, that does not mean we know what the rule would require or what it would cost or what the benefits to public health would be. All we know is simply thinking about a rule and doing something to move forward to initiate a rule stops EPA right in its tracks. And I don't think that makes any sense, because we are looking at impact on human life. And they want this task force to analyze impact on gas prices. Well, they don't have enough information to analyze the impact on gas prices, but that means they're going to stop EPA from analyzing the impact on human health and stop any actions to protect human health. And so my amendment says, and I guess I should talk like the Republicans, it's a simple amendment. Saying it's simple does not make it simple, but my amendment says that we're not going to delay finalization of any of the rules to establish standards for clean air to reduce air pollution if that pollution would be controlled by the finalized rules contributing to asthma attacks, acute and chronic bronchitis, heart attacks, cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, etc. So we're not going to let EPA be stopped. And we have to understand this bill simply, as we hear over and over again, simply cuts the heart out of the Clean Air Act. It says that standards don't even have to be set on health. That whole thing has been thrown out by this bill. So this is not a simple bill with simple changes. It's a radical bill that will harm people's health, and I urge the support for the amendment in opposition to the bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray.
Mr. Chairman, I got to regretfully speak in opposition of the amendment and make it clear this bill does not affect the ozone standards that are set today. It doesn't stop the development of rules to address those issues. And I've just got to say to both sides, this level of urgency about public health, that somehow any delay was a major disaster. Can I ask, that people take the time to think about the next time you use the word tailpipe emissions, will you ask your staff to look at why for 20 years the federal EPA has been still using an antiquated standard called tailpipe emissions, when the best air pollution scientists at CARB knew in '92 that those are inappropriate, inefficient, and misleading standards. But for 20 years, the federal government, who claims that we're urgently defending public health, have been using a standard that scientists have known is antiquated, failed, and was abandoned by the best air pollution strategists 20 years ago. Also, will you take the time to take a look at the studies that have been done on traffic management that predict up to 20% reduction in emissions and fuel consumption, which directly relates to fuel prices? Why have we constantly walked away from that standard or that challenge? And frankly, Mr. Chairman, I think that both of them is because it means government has to change the way we do business to improve air quality and reduce prices. Government has to change the way we're going to get the job done, rather than government requiring private citizens to change the way they
Gentleman yield.
Rather than...
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yield.
Give me a moment. I think the biggest problem is too many of us in this town think that our place at defending the consumer is to force private sector to do things and not look at how we're doing business that could have been and should have been done much better long time ago. And I yield to the gentleman from California.
I think, with all due respect, you're not correct in your statement that this doesn't affect the existing ozone standard. We have a standard set on protecting public health. Now that standard has to be implemented with rules to give states direction on what they have to do to meet that standard. Those very rules would be stopped under this legislation because that would have to go to this task force for analysis. So you served on the Air Resources Board in California, so you've had a great deal of personal experience. A lot of what you had to do was implement what the federal law required. That implementation required some rules by EPA. Well, this would stop EPA from issuing those rules. And what is this all about? It's about protecting public health.
Reclaiming my time. The greatest thing with it was really the modification of our SIP, and then we would send it back for approval into the FIP by the EPA, and that back and forth goes on. But, you know, frankly, I just hope that...
you can't do a SIP unless you know what EPA is asking
and you know
and the standard that's being set.
The standard is being set, but the standard has already, the ozone standards have been set. We know where they are. If they want to modify that and move that, I'm just saying, I'll say this bluntly to both sides of this aisle, you shouldn't be changing the standards until you go back and have a test, a measurement that's scientific. And tailpipe emission is not scientific. It is just convenient because it's the way it's always been done. Yield to the gentleman from...
I would just like to ask counsel, would this legislation affect in any way the current ozone standards and implementation of it?
The rule is written, excuse me, the bill is written, any rule revising or supplementing the national ambient air quality standards for ozone. So only a rulemaking that would revise or supplement the existing standard.
Right. And there's nothing in this rule that would preclude EPA from analyzing impact on health, is there?
No, there is
on any of these three rules.
No, benefits are included in the analysis in the bill.
And now, what is the correct terminology here? I shouldn't call this a rule. Is to say these are proposed rules? What is the correct term?
There are covered rules and actions. Those that are regulatory actions are among the covered rules. Covered actions would include the PSD permitting, PSD and Title V permitting actions.
Okay. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that I have an additional minute on this very subject.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to ask counsel, you said that this bill would block implementation rules of the standard. Is that correct?
No, I did not say that, sir.
Okay. What would be blocked?
Any rule revising or supplementing an existing...
Supplementing.
That's correct.
Now, what is a supplementing? Could that be implementation?
A supplement to an existing ozone standard would be a supplement to that standard, not necessarily a rule that is procedural or implementation of that standard. But supplementing the standard might include, for example, changing the averaging time, changing the level, changing the indicator.
Is there a definition of supplement in the bill?
No.
So you're telling me what you think supplement means. And I would submit that when the EPA is looking at how to implement existing standards, that could be considered a supplementary rule. EPA issues rules on how to implement the standards. I would submit, whether you intend it or not, this bill, among other things that it would do, would stop EPA from making sure that the existing ozone standard can be met, and it requires an analysis by a new bureaucratic interagency, not on health, but on impact on gasoline prices. And I think that that means that's more important than health in the outcome of this legislation if it were to pass.
Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No.
Roll call vote.
Roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Stearns votes no.
Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess votes no.
Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Ms. DeGette.
Mrs. DeGette votes aye.
Mr. Ross.
Mr. Ross votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 9 ayes, 29 nays.
9 ayes, 29 nays.
Correct.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
The committee will, or the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, gas prices are on the minds of many American families. But unfortunately, this bill under consideration will do nothing, absolutely nothing, to address those concerns. The Gasoline Regulations Act of 2012 uses the backdrop of today's gas prices to continue the majority party's assault on the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act without doing a single thing to actually reduce the cost that Americans are paying at the pump. This bill would delay vital Clean Air Act protections applicable to the largest polluters, diminish crucial public health benefits for all Americans, and will have zero effect and impact for lowering gas prices. The bill has far-reaching adverse health and environmental impacts, including, among others, fundamentally altering ozone public health standards and protections, and delaying a protective Tier 3 clean air program for passenger vehicles. Instead of looking into how the role of speculators impact gas prices, as I have requested in a March 15th letter, or holding a hearing to determine why big oil profits increased by $2 million for every additional penny that average Americans pay at the pump, the majority party is again seeking to attack EPA and dismantle the Clean Air Act. My amendment, Mr. Chairman, would get to the heart of whether or not this bill would directly impact gas prices. My amendment simply states that, and I quote, not later than 90 days after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator of the Energy Information Administration shall make a determination as to whether implementation of this act is projected to lower gasoline prices in the U.S. within 10 years, end of quote. However, Mr. Chairman, if the administrator of the EIA determines that implementation of this act is not projected to lower gasoline prices in the U.S. within 10 years, then Section 5 and 6 of this act would sunset and shall cease to be effective. Mr. Chairman, this subcommittee, or this committee, should not use the backdrop of high gas prices as an ill-informed reason to remove long-standing Clean Air Act requirements for EPA to set ambient air quality standards at the level necessary to protect human health. Nor should the majority attempt to block and delay several EPA air quality and public health protections when the bill's sponsor, my friend from Kentucky, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield, already admitted, and I quote, but there is nothing in our legislation, nor have we ever indicated that there is anything in this legislation that would in and of itself reduce gasoline prices, end of quote. Mr. Chairman, it makes absolutely no sense to attack long-standing Clean Air Act provisions that were enacted with bipartisan support, all in the name of lowering gasoline prices, which this bill clearly fails to do. So I urge all of my colleagues to vote for the Rush Amendment, which will clearly link the provisions of this bill with its ability to provide relief at the pump for the American consumer. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak, Mr. Whitfield is recognized.
Yeah, I seek recognition to oppose the amendment of the gentleman from Chicago. His amendment basically lets the Energy Information Administration administrator make the sole determination. Our legislation allows a committee to look at this, and I'm still really puzzled by why there's such angst about this piece of legislation to simply ask the administration or the administrator of EPA to look before you leap into issuing new regulations that may have an impact on gasoline prices. All we're asking is, on these three regulations, the Tier 3, the greenhouse gas from refineries, and the ozone, that before you issue new regulations, let's examine the cumulative impact that they may have on the price of gasoline. I don't think that I don't think any lawyer would look and say we're gutting the Clean Air Act or anything else. We're simply asking for additional information before you leap. And I still don't think this is inconsistent with President Obama's own regulation or executive order in which he asked agencies in his administration to look at the cumulative impact of regulations. I mean, what is so sacrosanct about potential regulations? Why should we not explore the impact that they have on certain elements of our society, in this case, gasoline prices? So
Would the gentleman yield?
With that, I would.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield to the gentleman.
I think part of the conflict that my Democrat friends has is the Obama administration Secretary of Energy 4 years ago actually advocated for gasoline prices of the level of Europe. Now, he's kind of retreated from that because the harsh reality is that sticks it to consumers in a way that destroys their economy and ours. And having been a small business owner for 2 decades plus, I always wanted to know what are the implications of the decisions that are about to be made in my own business. If I purchase something new, if I try and do something over here, what's the rate of return? What are the costs? What are the benefits? And all the gentleman's bill does is say the American consumers will have, and their policymakers will actually know in advance before some rule gets adopted, very limited set of rules, what the impact would be on gas prices. And that, I'll tell you, if you're a working mom, you're trying to get the kids out to the soccer practice and the dance and all that, and you're driving around in that van. And you're paying the pump $4.50, you're seeing it maybe hit $5. It just sucks the disposable income you barely have now right into your gas tank and out the other end. And when the federal government continues to put these crazy regulations on top of crazy regulations, you begin to believe that Secretary of Energy's call for European-level gas prices maybe is still being fostered through the Obama administration. So it's no wonder they want to cloak this assault on Americans with incredible regulations that shut down industry, paralyze growth, hurt our jobs, the worst recovery we've had since the Great Depression. There's no wonder why. You look at what the impact these rules and regulations have. So this is a common sense bill. So we just know what the costs are going to be.
The gentleman
and I would yield back to my friend from Kentucky.
Well, you make a good point, and that is the Secretary of Energy did make that comment that he wanted to get gasoline prices up equivalent to Europe. And we do understand that the Obama administration wants to push America into electric cars as soon as possible. And while we may not object to that, the reality is that the country is not in a position right now to use electric cars. And by the way, the stimulus money that went to Tesla and Fisker Automotive, they received large sums of taxpayer money to help develop electric cars. And the price tag on those electric cars is around $200,000 per car, which I might say is not looking after the average American worker in this country. So I'd be happy to yield.
The demagoguery that's focused on the Obama administration doesn't have a bag of beans to do with my amendment. My amendment is straight. It says that if the EIA within 10 years determined that within 10 years gas prices would not be reduced, then the provisions of this amendment will sunset and the bill will cease to exist. Now that's what my amendment is saying. My amendment doesn't address the European gasoline prices or any other matter. It's just, and it's, as you said, and as the ranking member of the full committee stated before, it's a simple amendment. It makes a lot of sense. If the EIA determines that within 10 years gasoline prices will not go down, then the amendment will sunset. It will cease. That's what my amendment. So the demagoguery, all sense is none.
But I certainly don't think we're demagoguing the issue here. I think we're talking about facts here, and I would simply oppose the amendment respectfully. And
gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
I know people want to vote without further discussion, but I think that further discussion is warranted on this amendment and this bill, because this is delivering the oil industry a wish list of their anti-environmental dreams. In effect, EPA has to take costs into consideration, impact on the economy, as well as health benefits. They look at all of these questions, they look at the science before they can decide on a rule. But this bill, the underlying bill says, oh, that's all well and good, but here are a bunch of things that the EPA might act on, And if they do act on it, they can't finish their work until this interagency task force can evaluate what the impact of those rules would be on the price of gasoline and jobs. But they don't know what the rule is. So they're doing an analysis without knowing what the rule is. But it keeps EPA from acting. Now, let's look at gasoline prices. Gasoline prices are determined by the world price for oil. If we stop EPA from regulations to protect people from all these dreaded illnesses, and we don't allow EPA to regulate to protect the environment, is that going to lower gasoline prices, which is dependent on the world oil price? It's simply going to say that the oil companies can get away with of not doing anything to live up to requirements to protect public health. I think the analysis.
Well, the gentleman yield?
No, not yet, but I might in a minute. We're being told is that gasoline prices are affected by protection of public health in the United States. And therefore, we're not going to protect public health in the United States, presumably to allow more production of oil. Maybe. But even if we have more production of oil in the United States, that's not going to lead to lower gasoline prices because it's dependent on the world oil price. So the Republican strategy is not a secret. What we see here is a political message. It's a messaging strategy to attack the president. The bill has nothing to do with protecting consumers from high gasoline prices. If enacted, it would not lower prices by 1 penny. But the bill has everything to do with weakening public health protections and providing huge giveaways to polluters in an election year. Now, the top 5 oil companies pocketed $137 billion in profits last year. That's a staggering amount of money. That's larger than the GDP of most nations in the world. These companies can afford to comply with modest requirements that hold them responsible for the pollution they produce. But this bill would stop EPA from requiring oil refineries to reduce toxic air pollution. Toxic air pollution produces cancer and birth defects, neurological damage. And we won't require the oil refineries to reduce those pollutions that do such harm. It would stop EPA from requiring cleaner cars and the fuels they need to run on. It would even stop EPA from implementing the 2008 standard for ozone pollution issued by President Bush, all in the name of lowering gasoline prices. But it wouldn't lower gasoline prices at all. Now, Mr. Whitfield said maybe eventually it would lower gasoline prices. It means you have to believe that if you never have environmental regulations of the polluters, that they'll be able to have lower gasoline prices. Well, why would that be the case? There's no evidence of that. This amendment doesn't ask the EIA to do some sort of complicated analysis. It asks, based on EIA's understanding of the fundamentals of crude oil and gasoline markets, to study and block future air pollution requirements. And so I would suggest that the Rush amendment is an important amendment to stop this impact from happening. I'd be happy to yield to.
Would you, gentlemen, yield?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to take just the final seconds.
Well, I ask unanimous consent for an additional minute so I can yield to both of the gentlemen that have asked me to yield.
Without objection.
I think that the ranking member has made a very salient point here. And I don't think that the committee should just ignore or just overlook his point. The underlying bill blocks the EPA rules that have not yet been proposed. So we are dealing with some kind of a shadowy figure that doesn't exist. It's a figment of the Republicans' vivid imagination. The rule the EPA doesn't have any rules yet. And so here we are blocking the rules that don't exist. It reminds me
And
of...
your amendment, which is what's pending, says that the Energy Information Administration would determine whether or not this bill will lower gasoline prices. And if it does not, then the bill's most offensive provisions about stopping protection of public health would have no effect. Isn't that right?
That's what my amendment states.
I don't know why anybody vote against that. I'd like to yield to, who was asking me? Well, maybe
We're gonna
at your
ask
own
for
time.
Gentlemen,
Sorry.
the time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Shimkus from Illinois.
To speak against the amendment, first of all, allowing a single member of the interagency committee to circumvent the analysis will defeat the whole purpose of the act. Gas prices impact all parts of our economy, so we need multiple expert agencies. EIA does not have expertise in international competitiveness, job impacts, definitely agriculture, or health benefits analysis. So that's why I oppose this particular amendment. Now I'd like to yield to my colleague from Kentucky.
Thank you very much. Some comments were made a few minutes ago that this legislation was really for the benefit of big oil companies. And I can tell you, you read through here, I don't see any benefit for big oil companies in here. The sole purpose of this legislation is to look at the cumulative impact of 3 proposed rules. They're not final yet. And it does not preclude EPA from considering health benefits. It does not preclude EPA from finalizing a rule. It simply asks for an analysis of the cumulative impact of these regulations on gasoline prices. So I just wanted to clarify that. There's nothing in here to benefit oil companies. I recognize that we all like to demonize big oil companies.
Will the gentleman yell?
It's not my time.
Will the gentleman yell?
My colleague from Kentucky returns the time to me, and I yield to my friend from Chicago.
We cannot get beyond the fact that these rules are non-existent. They don't exist. The rules that you are so afraid of, the rules that you're hankering about, the rules that's got you all up in a tizzy, don't exist. They don't exist. You can't get beyond that. You're arguing and debating on rules that do not even exist. Nowhere.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, and I appreciate my friend. That's the whole point. We like to have this analysis before the rules get enacted. How many times have we had EPA before the subcommittee, and we said, do you quantify increase in energy costs and the effects on jobs and the economy? You know what they say? No. In fact, there's actually court cases that in the diesel engine arena that prohibit them from doing that. All we're saying is it might be nice to know what the effects that these new rules and regulations will have on the additional costs of the average consumer when they're trying to go from home to school, from home to the grocery store. Of course, as you know, I'm from rural America. My new congressional district will have 33 counties. That's a lot of time on the road. If there's just for an individual citizen from Olney, Illinois, to go to the hospital, to go to the community college, they drive long distances. I will argue high gas prices have a huge disparate impact on poor, rural Americans. I just think we ought to know, and we ought to have an analysis before the EPA finalizes the rule, what is going to be the impact. So I appreciate my colleague for bringing up the bill. I've stated the reasons why I don't think this amendment is helpful, and with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are the other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the Rush amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is defeated. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentlelady from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will, which number?
009. Avoiding duplication.
Clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Ms. DeGette of Colorado.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The title of this so-called Strategic Energy Production Act is completely misleading. There's nothing about this bill that's strategic in its approach, and it will do nothing to lower gasoline prices. Gasoline prices are set on the global market, and experts agree that increased domestic production will have virtually no effect on the prices we pay at the pump. Well, even worse, this bill will make our country more vulnerable to energy supply disruptions by making it more difficult to use the nation's...
Excuse me, the gentlelady will suspend. We believe that this amendment is for the next bill that we're taking up.
Oh, okay,
All right.
I'll withdraw it.
Are there further amendments? Are there further amendments to this bill? Gentlelady from Virgin Islands.
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment at the desk.
I don't know what I did with it.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Mrs. Christensen of the Virgin Islands.
And the amendment will be considered as read.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Texas.
I want to reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from Texas reserves a point of order on the amendment. The amendment will be considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have the amendment read.
Okay.
No, I don't object.
The amendment will be read. Clerk will read the amendment.
After Section 1, insert the following section and redesignate the subsequent sections and conform internal cross-references accordingly. Section 2, findings. The Congress finds the following. 1. According to the Energy Information Administration, since September 2011, 2 refineries in the Philadelphia area, ConocoPhillips Trainer Refinery and Sunoco's Marcus Hook Refinery, and 1 major Caribbean refinery supplying the East Coast, Hovensa's U.S. Virgin Islands refinery, have closed. In addition, Sunoco announced plans to sell or idle its remaining Philadelphia area refinery by July 2012. 2. According to the Energy Information Administration, U.S. consumption of motor gasoline fell in 2011, particularly on the East Coast, and is projected to continue to decline. 3. A spokesman for Valero Energy said that it is, in quotes, very difficult to compete, end quote, in the East Coast market, but if there was a demand for product there, those refineries wouldn't close. 4. IHS Cambridge Energy Research Associates stated that East Coast refineries have been most vulnerable to market conditions because they are buying crude at high prices, but they have to sell gasoline in a very competitive market, which is shrinking. 5. According to the Congressional Research Service, East Coast refineries have been particularly unprofitable due to reduced refinery capacity utilization. 6. In February 2012, ConocoPhillips informed its shareholders of the severe market pressure facing its Trainer, Pennsylvania refinery, and other refineries on the East Coast. 7. In an open letter to the Pennsylvania community, Sunoco listed 3 market factors that forced the company to close or sell its Philadelphia and Marcus Hook refineries: expensive crude oil, declining demand for gasoline, and overcapacity in the refining sector. The company did not cite environmental regulations as a factor. 8. Hovensa stated that it decided to close its St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands refinery because of economic losses caused by weakness in demand for refined petroleum products due to the global economic slowdown and the addition of new refining capacity in emerging markets. 9. According to the Energy Information Administration, in 2011, U.S. refining capacity reached 17.7 million barrels per day, the highest level in at least 25 years. In particular, Gulf Coast refineries have increased their capacity by more than 1 million barrels per day since 2000. 10. Therefore, in light of the findings in paragraphs 1 through 9, market forces, not environmental regulations, were primary factors driving companies to close or sell refineries in Pennsylvania and the Virgin Islands.
Amendment being finished, the gentlelady, point of order has been reserved. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for...
Would the gentlelady suspend briefly? Just, I want to ask, would the gentlelady suspend?
Yes, sir. Yes.
I want to, Mr. Chairman, I am going to insist on my point of order, but I don't have any problem if you want to let the gentlelady explain her amendment.
Yeah, no. So the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment, and then we'll
thank you,
deal
and
with the
thank
point
you
of order.
for your patience in having the amendment read. Republicans in the House have suggested that environmental and health protections are to blame for recent refinery closures in the United States and its territories. Speaker John Boehner has also repeated claims that, quote, extremely challenging regulations, end of quote, for U.S. refineries are causing gasoline prices to rise. The bill we're discussing would block and delay EPA rules designed to clean up vehicles and fuels and cut air pollution from refineries. Chairman Whitfield suggested that EPA is, and again I'm quoting, poised to pile on a new wave of costly regulations affecting gasoline and diesel fuel, end of quote, and by extension refineries. But the truth is that the recent refinery closures were not driven by environmental protections, and they certainly were not caused by regulations that have not yet been imposed. The truth is that recent decisions to close or sell refineries along the East Coast are based on market factors such as oil prices, consumer demand, and competition. My amendment simply lays out some key facts. The facts matter because if Congress misunderstands the cause of the problem, it's not likely to produce an effective solution. And the facts of this matter in particular are very important to me. My constituents are feeling the effects of Hovenza's plan to shut down its refinery on St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. This refinery has been by far the largest private employer in the U.S. Virgin Islands. When it announced the refinery closure, the company stated very clearly that the closure was due to $1.3 billion in economic losses, and I'm quoting here, caused primarily by weaknesses in demand for refined petroleum products due to the global economic slowdown and the addition of new refining capacity in emerging markets, end of quote. The company also noted that as an oil-fired refiner, it was at a competitive disadvantage with other mainland refiners that used cheaper natural gas to power their facilities. The company's CEO testified before the Senate of the U.S. Virgin Islands and reiterated that poor market conditions, including a drop in demand for the refinery's petroleum products, had put it on a path to bankruptcy. He also dismissed suggestions that an EPA order to install modern pollution controls was a factor in the company's decision to close the refinery. The Pennsylvania refineries have also faced challenging market conditions. They process the most expensive type of crude oil. Demand for their products has fallen, and excess capacity has squeezed their profit margins. Elsewhere in the United States, refineries are thriving. In 2011, U.S. refining capacity reached 17.7 million barrels per day, the highest level in at least 25 years. In particular, Gulf Coast refineries have been able to process cheaper sources of crude compared to the rest of the country and maximize production. As a result, several refineries in the Gulf Coast are actually expanding their capacity. My amendment simply lays out these facts. Environmental protections, such as the ones that would be blocked by this bill, did not cause the refineries in Pennsylvania and the Virgin Islands to close their doors. They face crippling market conditions beyond their control and actually beyond the control of the President. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentlelady
I yield.
yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I've been told by committee staff that the parliamentarians have changed their mind, that they've now decided that it is a borderline call, but it is probably germane. So I withdraw my point of order, but I do want to be recognized in opposition to the amendment in terms of policy.
Just note, I'm told that it is a borderline call, and they say that it's likely not germane, but when they're this close, we'll go ahead with it and remove the objection. Gentleman from Texas removes his objection and is recognized for 5 minutes.
I think it's good, Mr. Chairman, to have a vigorous policy debate. While you could argue on germaneness issues, I think it's better for the committee and the public if we actually argue the merits of the case. I have great sympathy for the gentlelady's situation in her district. Losing a major employer like the refinery that she's referred to is a huge economic blow, and it's a personal blow. When all those folks have those jobs and they lose those jobs, it causes emotional distress and as well as economic distress. So I've got nothing but sympathy for what's happening in her area. Having said that, this amendment is somewhat disingenuous because it's based on the premise that additional environmental regulations have no cost, and that these refineries that are closing are not closing because of the cost of environmental protection. As my good friend from Texas, Mr. Green, can attest to, you can have environmental protection and economic prosperity. His district probably has more refineries and petrochemical complexes than any other district in the country. But having said that, there is a cost to additional environmental protection, and there is a cost to upgrade these refineries to maintain the regulations that are in place here in the United States. And I think it is fair to say that the United States, which not only has, as it should have, the most aggressive environmental protection regulations in place, also enforces those. And some of these older refineries in a very competitive market, when faced with some of the things the gentlelady's amendment has rightfully pointed out, they cannot compete unless they get our grandfather or get waivers on various regulatory additions, and so they do shut down. Refineries overseas, especially the newer refineries in the Middle East and in the Asian rim, have state-of-the-art technology, but they do not have some of the environmental requirements that we have here in the United States. And as Mr. Waxman has pointed out repeatedly today, it's a world market. It is less expensive sometimes to refine crude overseas and import it into the eastern market because they don't have the environmental requirements that we have here in the United States. So it's the gentlelady's amendment, I think, so far as it goes, does state the truth, but it doesn't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
Thank you for yielding. The very last sentence in her amendment says, therefore, in light of the findings, market forces, not environmental regulations, were the primary factors driving companies to close or sell refineries. And I might say we have a letter from Sunoco in which it says there were other factors, but the expense of capital to meet the environmental regulatory requirements certainly contributed to it. And then the Department of Energy issued a report on March 2011, and it says the cost of compliance contributed to the economic stresses that resulted in the shutdown of 66 refineries from 1990 through 2010. So if we adopt her amendment, we're basically saying these regulations do not have much to do with it. And I think the letter and the report from DOE shows that that is not the case. And so I would respectfully ask that we defeat the gentlelady's amendment.
If I could reclaim, the gentleman from Kentucky, the distinguished subcommittee chairman, just makes the point that I've been making. There is a cost to environmental protection. There are also benefits, but there is a cost. And as we tighten and tighten and tighten our already stringent existing regulations, those costs go up, and they don't improve efficiency. So again, as Mr. Waxman has pointed out, in a world market where you're competing against refineries that don't have these restrictions in place, it does become more and more costly to keep these refineries in the United States that are older open, because we can't upgrade to meet the new cost of compliance. Therefore, they shut down because of foreign competition and sometimes because of domestic competition, as the gentlelady's pointed out. So I would oppose the amendment on policy grounds and hope that we vote it down.
Time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment because you say the truth. Somebody just said the truth, not the whole truth. Well, this bill is not the whole truth because this bill is painting a picture that the solution to rising gasoline prices is to weaken public health and environmental protections. And the Christensen Amendment would inject some much-needed facts into this bill's text. It clarifies the real reasons why several East Coast refineries have been put up for sale or closed. I have an ad submitted by Sunoco, and they talk about all their problems. Expensive crude oil, declining demand for gasoline, overcapacity in our industry, and they don't mention at all environmental regulations. Yet the premise of the bill is that environmental regulations is the reason why gasoline prices are high and why refineries are closing. I think that that's an amazing statement for this bill, and I think the Christensen Amendment adds some reality. My Republican colleagues would have us believe that regulations should reduce toxic air pollution from refineries or make gasoline cleaner. Regulations that haven't yet even been proposed are in some ways keeping gasoline prices high and putting refineries out of business. That's silly. That is just plain silly. How can regulations that haven't been proposed on environmental requirements keep gasoline prices high? Even the refineries don't say that. And the Christensen Amendment would give some big, clearer picture of what really is happening.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to you.
Thank you. I mean, look, this is a messaging bill that's going nowhere. If Republicans want to make the case that regulations are raising gasoline prices, the American people aren't going to buy that. They're smarter than that. I don't know about the gentlelady's refinery in her district, but in Pennsylvania, I do know about those two refineries. I have spoken personally to both of the representatives of the refineries. They've had an open letter to all Pennsylvanians, and they had private letters to members of the Pennsylvania congressional delegation. They listed 3 market factors that forced the Philadelphia plant to close. It was expensive crude oil, declining demand for gasoline, and overcapacity. I would note, however, if environmental regulations were the big hook they were losing money, both of these refineries in Pennsylvania that are selling have buyers. The Carlyle Group in one and Delta Airlines in the other. And they plan to operate these as refineries. So if the environmental regulation was so onerous that they couldn't make any money or there wasn't a business model that made sense, I don't think you'd see 2 buyers right now getting ready to they're in negotiations. These deals haven't been finalized, but they're negotiating to buy the refineries and operate them as refineries. So, I think we all understand what we're doing here today. This is just, it's silly season now and people are making messages. But, the idea, at least in Pennsylvania, that somehow EPA environmental regulations shut these refineries down, just has no basis in reality. I'll yield back.
I reclaim my time. You make an excellent point. This bill is a political exercise designed to blame the president for market conditions outside of his control. And this debate is also counterproductive. It's draining the time and energy of members and staff that should be better devoted to finding real solutions to America's energy problems. But this isn't recent. That's all this committee has done for the last year and a half. Message bills. We pass them out of committee, we pass them off the floor, and they go nowhere. And they're all to give the message to the American people: stop regulations that protect public health. You don't need them, especially when it's going to cause economic hardship. And it's not an accurate statement, but that's the propaganda line. and they want to blame all problems on the President of the United States. It's as if Republicans didn't control the White House and the Congress and didn't cause our economic problems by not paying for the spending that they undertook during the Bush administration. Yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky, can we vote on this amendment?
No, just make one comment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Once again, we're not saying that environmental regulations contribute to, has required all of the closings or all of the price of gasoline. Her amendment says that market forces and market forces alone are the primary factors. And we have ample evidence from all sorts of sources that that's simply not the case. And we're not trying to blame the president. We're trying to help the president have his executive order obeyed. He issued an executive order requiring that new regulations, initiated regulations, that they look at the cumulative cost of those. GAO issued a report just recently that says regulatory factors such as national air quality standards that have induced some states to switch to special gasoline blends contribute to the gasoline prices. They also say that we have the letter from Sunoco once again that says expensive capital to meet the environmental regulatory requirements does contribute to their decision to close some refineries. A 2007 GAO study concluded gasoline prices are determined based upon, yes, supply and demand, regulations such as national air quality standards set by EPA, refinery capacity, and available inventories. So we're not saying it's the only cause, but it is a cause, and all this legislation does is say, let's look at it. Let's have the information. And with that, I'd yield back, balance my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I support the amendment, although I disagree with the final statement that says market forces, not environmental regulations. Market forces and environmental regulations, because if you have an old asset, then if the market forces don't work, then you're not willing to invest in the plant. And whether it's in eastern Pennsylvania or anywhere else, but everything else in the amendment is correct. And that's my only frustration. I want to support the amendment, but it's just not environment. It's also market forces, whether it be in the Virgin Islands, whether it be in eastern Pennsylvania, or in some of the other places in our country that refineries have shut down. As my colleague from Texas noted, I'm fortunate to represent a number of refineries that have actually expanded. And yet we've cleaned up our air in Houston, Texas. Is it where we want it to be? Of course not. But we will get there. But we also want to keep those thousands of jobs that those refineries and the chemical plants that are near them provide. But it is a difference of market forces and the environmental regulations. If you haven't invested in your plant, whether it's to keep it up for the environment or keep it up to where it's efficient, and all of a sudden you come in and have to do it, it's economically not possible, particularly for these facilities where because of the price of the crude oil so much higher than it is in the Gulf Coast. With that, I yield back my time, and I understand the frustration. I'd be the same place Ms. Christensen was at if I was losing a refinery in my district too.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I want to say in issues such as this, I certainly think that the review of the impact of regulations on refineries being built and the impact on pricing, et cetera, are all worthy for review of this committee. Certainly, I'd like to see us have hearings along those issues before we declare a finding like this without talking to the principals involved who own the refineries in Pennsylvania, who are in them, or in negotiations. And I would hope we could go that route to gather factual information first before we move on something like this. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I think we're ready to vote. All those in favor of the Christensen amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Other gentlelady asks for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to still cast a vote, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Stearns votes no.
Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden votes no.
Mr. Terry.
Mr. Terry votes no.
Dr. Gingrey.
Mr. Gingrey votes no.
Ms. McMorris Rogers.
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no.
Ms. DeGette.
Ms. DeGette votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 ayes, 30 nays.
16 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. I would just note that as we are watching the clock and watching the floor, it is my hope that we might be able to finish. We have a couple of more amendments that I believe will be offered. My hope is that we could finish those amendments and get to final. We intend to adjourn about noon. And we're expecting votes at 1:10 on the House floor. I should say recess at about noon, and come back after the votes on the floor, which would be 2 o'clock. So hope is to finish this bill before noon. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Mr. Green of Texas.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will distribute the amendments, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike Section 6 of the bill. This section of the bill would require the EPA to consider industry costs when determining what level of air pollution is safe. By doing this, we would be rolling back one of the core aspects of the Clean Air Act, which was passed on a bipartisan basis over 40 years ago and signed into law by a Republican president and unanimously upheld by the Supreme Court in 2001. The Clean Air Act directs the EPA to set the level of each ambient air quality standard based on what's necessary to protect health including the health of sensitive groups such as children. The law makes a clear distinction. The EPA may not consider cost in setting these science-based standards that essentially identify the levels of pollution that are safe for people to breathe and establish the goals of healthy air quality across the country. Economic costs are considered several times in the process, though. The EPA conducts a regulatory impact analysis for a range of emission standards when they propose a standard. Then they do a second regulatory impact analysis when they finalize the standard. The most important time, however, is the last step, which Congressman Bilbray mentioned in the subcommittee markup. Once the standard has been final, the EPA and the states develop deadlines and plans for achieving the health-based standards. States write specific plans to adopt pollution control measures that may make the most sense in their communities and fully consider the cost. As a result, the compliance deadlines, which can take into account costs, can vary for each facility according to the difficulty of the standards. So let me repeat that. Compliance schedules can vary facility by facility due to the facility's specific economic and feasibility conditions. Some of these refineries, if it was only pollution, they could be given some extra time to do things. Mr. Chairman, as all members of this committee, I probably have the most sensitive, of what regulatory compliance costs mean to refinery operators, and 5 large refineries, and one is actually the largest refinery in the country. So I get it, and I'm pleased the administration decided not to revisit the ozone NOx standards last September for that very reason. However, that does not mean that we should fundamentally change the 40-year-old law, bipartisanly authored cornerstone of the Clean Air Act. I expect my friends on the Republican side will say this section simply forces EPA to follow the President's executive order. That's why we have an OMB, and I'm happy to have that battle with OMB if I disagree with the regulatory impact analysis that the EPA sends them to review. In fact, I want to share my colleague from Texas, Mr. Barton, that we have met with OMB and on issues that affect us, and we've had some success. I'm happy to petition our state regulators on behalf of the companies in my district to ensure they can comply with ozone NOx standards without so much economic stress. But let's don't pretend that this section isn't anything but messaging. My Republican colleagues supported this language before, and a Republican president signed it into law. Fundamentally changing the Clean Air Act is not going to bring down gas prices, and we are setting a dangerous precedent in the committee by saying that unhealthy levels of pollution become healthy when costs of cleaning up are too high. If you're okay setting this precedent, you can vote against the amendment. But if you agree that we're going down a dangerous road by saying the unhealthy levels of pollution become healthy when the costs of cleaning it up are too high, then vote for my amendment. The committee is much better than this. We passed a very few bills this year on a bipartisan basis. Pipeline safety, which our chair and our chair emeritus co-sponsored, PDUFA last week, whereas most of these bills I would like to vote for because there's reason to support them. I want the delay that this original bill does, but by going in to change the Clean Air Act, it makes it difficult for those of us who also have to balance that, both economic development and jobs with also the clean air. Our committee, we need to go beyond messaging bills and go back to addressing our problems our country faces in a practical and bipartisan way. If this amendment was adopted, I could very easily vote for the bill because I want to give our refineries a little more time to deal with what they have to do without reopening the Clean Air Act. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, there's not a lot of daylight between my friend from Texas, Mr. Green, and myself on some of these issues, but I'm a little bit puzzled. One of the premises of the underlying bill is, before we go further, let's make sure we understand what market forces are at play and how various pending environmental regulations impact cost and those market forces. If I understand the gentleman's amendment correctly, he strikes the section that deals with reviewing the cost of pending regulations. Is that correct?
Well, I don't want to change Clean Air Act, but the rest of the bill, I don't mind the delay and study the impact of environmental. But to actually go in and make those basic changes in the Clean Air Act, that's all our amendment does.
But your amendment strikes the section that relates to consideration of feasibility and cost in revising or supplementing.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
The national ambient air quality standard. It strikes the section of the bill that says before we implement or go further, we should at least look at what those things cost.
Gentlemen, yield.
Isn't that correct?
Joe?
Sure, I'll yield to
The whole premise of the Act since 1970 is that the EPA decides on a standard to protect public health. And then in implementing that standard, we look at all the cost considerations, the impact, economic impact. And some areas get more time, some get less time. Some have more to do, some have less to do. That has always been the way this whole law has worked. On the floor, the House adopted an amendment that we never had a day of hearings on in our committee. It wasn't offered in committee. It was offered on the floor by our colleague, Mr. Latta. And that said, oh, no, the standards are not going to be based on protecting public health. The standards are going to be based on a balancing of public health and costs. That has not been the law for 40 years. Now that new standard is going to be set differently, but the rest of the law still applies in terms of implementing what needs to be done to meet that standard. We don't have all the standards in this bill. We only have the ozone standard. So Mr. Green's amendment would say the ozone standard should be set as it is in existing law. But the rest of the bill, the rest of the existing law would still apply in terms of economic considerations, and this bill would apply. Is that correct?
Yeah. What I'm trying to do is to give some time frame for refineries to be able to do this and do the study and not go back and change, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as we say in Texas. We can deal with the study and the delay, but we still want to have the same law, the basic law we've dealt with for 40 years.
Well, if I could reclaim my time, I understand Mr. Whitfield's bill, which I'm now a co-sponsor of. It simply says, before we go further, let's do this study. And you have to, I would think you would have to consider the feasibility and the cost in revising or supplementing these national ambient air quality standards. If your amendment is adopted, it guts the bill.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah. I'd yield my friend from...
I would like to ask counsel a question here. It is true that as related to ozone, this would change the Clean Air Act. Now, this came about because of the American Trucking Association versus Whitman case that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the question there was whether or not you can consider cost when you're coming forth with new ambient air quality standards as it relates to ozone. And the court said what?
The court interpreted the act to be ambiguous with respect to whether cost.
So it said it was ambiguous, and that's why they said you've got to consider cost. Well, my point is that under new source performance standards and the Clean Air Act, cost must be considered under Section 111. Under emission standards for automobiles, Section 202, cost must be considered. Fuel additives and reformulate gasoline provisions, Section 211, cost must be included. Aircraft emissions, Section 231, cost must be looked at, and all of these costs must be considered. And that's all that this legislation does here, is that we don't say how you make the decision or anything else. We just say, let's consider the cost, because the only reason costs are not being considered there today is because the Supreme Court said the language was ambiguous. Thank you.
I think my time is about to expire, so I'm going to oppose the Green amendment, but I am willing to consider a discussion of it at a later time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. West.
I'd like to ask counsel, where in the opinion did the court say the issue is ambiguous?
The court said that the language was ambiguous and therefore it would not imply that consideration of costs was required, and so the court said there was ambiguity.
In what?
In the Clean Air Act.
No, I understand we're talking about the Clean Air Act. Look, this was a case that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court held unanimously that the law requires that when standards are set, it be set based on protecting the public health. That was their finding. It was unanimous finding. And they weren't ambiguous at all. Let me read what Justice Scalia wrote in that opinion. He said, for the court, the Clean Air Act, quote, unambiguously bars cost considerations from the NAAQS, the National Air Quality Standard Setting process, and thus ends the matter for us as well as EPA. He's saying it's not ambiguous. Even if you wanted to do it differently, it's not ambiguous because the law does not allow it. Is that correct?
The basis for
is that the finding or not?
The ultimate finding is that EPA should not consider costs in setting the standards. However, the basis for the rationale for that is that we have refused to find implicit in ambiguous sections of the Clean Air Act an authorization to consider costs that has elsewhere and so often been expressly granted.
Well, in other words, they're rejecting the arguments that people were making that there's some ambiguous sections that should require the taking into consideration of costs in setting the standard. That sounds to me that's what the court was saying. Before I yield to you, but the court was saying, well, you may argue, counsel, that requires this further determination. The law is unambiguous in its language.
Yeah. Well, with the gentleman. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're focusing on this point because there is a difference of opinion here, and the gentleman, in which opinion did they say that the language was ambiguous as it relates to costs being considered in ambient air quality standards?
This is in the American Trucking Supreme Court decision.
But who wrote that opinion?
Justice Scalia.
Well,
so now Mr. Waxman's saying that Justice Scalia said it was totally unambiguous, but you've indicated that there's a place in there where he said it was ambiguous.
They say that the sections of the Clean Air Act addressing National Ambient Air Quality Standards, that these are ambiguous sections of the Clean Air Act.
So you're reclaiming my time. Somebody made an argument to the court that there are other sections of the Clean Air Act that are ambiguous and that would allow them to require that costs be considered in setting the standard. But Justice Scalia, probably not happily, said that's not true. Justice Scalia, on behalf of a unanimous court, says that the language of the Clean Air Act unambiguously bars cost considerations for the standard setting. Is that a correct statement?
That's a correct quote. The provisions of the Act that address National Ambient Air Quality Standards don't say whether or not to consider costs. It's silent.
But the court said that the standard for 40 years under the Clean Air Act, that the standards be set on protecting the public health, was going to be unchanged. Is that the result of the court decision?
That was the court.
Okay. So what I want to tell my colleagues is this isn't tinkering around the edges. This is a fundamental change in the Clean Air Act as we've known it for 40 years.
Would the gentleman yield?
The court unanimously said. One other point before I yield.
I'm going to agree with you if you'll yield.
Yeah, but the other point is all the other things in this law still apply. Yeah. It's just a question, once they set the standard, then the implementation would be based on cost considerations, and the rest of the law that's being proposed would still apply. Yield to you.
I want to, every now and then you actually have fundamental truth emerge in these debates. Doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it ought to be recognized. And the gentleman from Texas and the gentleman from California have clarified something that the gentleman of Kentucky has just agreed with me on. What Mr. Waxman just said is absolutely true. Under the Clean Air Act, as it's currently written, you can look at cost and consider cost, but ultimately the EPA administrator has the ability to set a regulatory standard without considering the cost. Now, Mr. Whitfield and I think that's wrong. We think costs should actually have more weight.
And if the gentleman would yield to me, let me just point out that paragraph 4 on page 6 is not affected at all by the Green Amendment. And I think you were concerned about whether that was going to be not affected. And that's all the stuff that requires the review on impact on gasoline prices.
Well, what the Green Amendment has elucidated or illuminated is that at some point in the very near future, this committee should go back and fundamentally look at the Clean Air Act.
If we do it, we ought to do it with a hearing and understand the full implications.
I agree with
that amendment
that.
was adopted on the floor with 5 minutes on each side, I believe, on the debate, and that was a fundamental change to the Clean Air Act that deserved more consideration by this committee, and we shouldn't further take that latter provision and apply it here.
I am siding with Mr. Whitfield. It is time to fundamentally look at these issues, and Mr. Whitfield is to be commended for putting into this bill a provision that perhaps indirectly begins to address that issue.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on this amendment? The gentlelady from Colorado.
Move to strike the last word. I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I want to thank my Colorado colleague. This bill is sitting on our desk, members. The only part that I have is the last part of the bill, Section 6 on page 9. The rest of this bill would stay in effect. What I'm trying to do is not go into what my colleague from Texas wants to do. He wants to go into basic text of the Clean Air Act. If we want to do that, let's look at separate legislation. I have companies who would benefit from every other section of this bill 1 through 8. And that's why I want an amendment that would compromise the bill so we don't take out, let's don't go after the Clean Air Act. We will end up, this bill being the same way that our carbon bill was, our Train Act, everything else. We'll send this to the Senate and it will die. I represent enough refineries that I want to have some help for them so we can look at this, what this bill does, but doesn't go in and reopen the Clean Air Act. That's all this asks. If we want to do the Clean Air Act, let's bring a bill up and have a full hearing. In fact, the subcommittee ought to do it, but a give and take. But don't let's do it with a bill that really is needed to be done. And that's what we've done this session, and it's been frustrating as a legislator, particularly one that represents a lot of industries and people who work there that would benefit, but we're not seeing that happen. It'll go to the Senate and die, and we will not have any help. Section 1 through 8 will not benefit anyone if it's not made into law. And if we put this Section 9 in there, Section 6 in there, it will still have, we will still be able to have that study and maybe have a chance of passing the United States Senate and helping some of the industries we're concerned about. That's why this amendment is here. It just takes out that one section, Section 6, and but the rest of the bill I can vote for. But with that, with the bill the way it is, and I said this in subcommittee, I didn't carry the amendment because I wanted to wait for the full committee so we would know. We only strike one section. The rest of that bill, this bill can be effective, and I support it. And I thank my colleague from Colorado for yielding.
Gentlelady yield back. Chair would just say we'd enjoy going to conference with the Senate. Are there additional members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the green amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. You need a chair. The noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. No. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. No. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes no. Mr. Walden. No. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess.
He eliminates part of
Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray.
No.
Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to vote? Mr. Terry.
Mr. Terry votes no.
Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess votes no.
Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Mr. Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes, 28 nays.
18 ayes, 28 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title.
What is the number of your amendment, Mr.
05.
Amendment to H.R. 4471 offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
Amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment, and the staff will distribute the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill that we're working on creates a new interagency committee to do what is really the impossible, conduct an analysis of EPA air qualities that have not been proposed using data that does not exist. And I'm concerned that this new interagency committee is being set up to fail. First, the bill requires the new committee to examine the potential impact of several EPA air quality rules on gasoline prices. There's one significant problem. These rules have not yet been proposed. We can argue about whether they have been initiated, contemplated, discussed, mulled over, considered, etc., but the fundamental fact is that the rules and their requirements have not even yet been proposed. The committee simply has nothing concrete to analyze. As a result, any report that this interagency committee completes will be the product of a series of best guesses, estimates, approximations, and assumptions that it cannot possibly provide a credible assessment of the potential impact of these potential rules on gasoline prices. Moreover, it may not even be possible for the interagency committee to complete this analysis, as insufficient as it would be, without a significant investment of resources at the Department of Energy. We asked the Energy Information Administration what it would take to complete this analysis. EIA, which is better positioned than any other government agency to tackle this project, said that it currently does not have the analytic capacity to conduct the state or regional level breakdowns required by this bill. The agency also would have to collect or purchase new data, despite the bill's hollow assurances that this isn't necessary, and they'd also have to devote significant new staff and contractor time to be able to comply with the bill's requirements. In essence, this bill proposes to devote scarce taxpayer dollars to produce a report that will not be reliable, will not be credible, or actually be valuable to anyone. And so my amendment simply states that if the Department of Energy determines that this analysis will be infeasible to conduct, that it requires data that does not exist, or would generate results subject to such large estimates of uncertainty that the results would be neither reliable nor useful, then the interagency committee does not have to complete the report. And in addition, rules covered by the bill would thus no longer be delayed. This amendment is a good governance amendment. It ensures effective use of taxpayer dollars, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Members wishing to speak on this side against the amendment? Gentleman from Kentucky, recognized briefly.
I'll just make one comment. First of all, this legislation does not authorize the expenditure of any additional funds. All of these agencies that are part of this task force already have a budget in which they routinely review issues like this. And this amendment would basically render our bill almost ineffective, and we don't think that just one person should make that determination. So I would respectfully request that we vote against the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California.
I support the gentlelady's amendment. Our country is facing a fiscal cliff at the end of this year. We need to work together to fill a gap that amounts to trillions of dollars. Some will propose slashing Medicare and other critical public safety net programs. We'll be working hard to find every penny we can to fill that gap. The CAPS amendment helps in one small way. The new bureaucracy the Republicans want to create will cost millions of dollars. It hasn't yet been scored by the CBO, but DOE has told us it will take a substantial amount of resources. The CAPS amendment simply states that if this analysis would be infeasible to conduct, require data that doesn't exist, or would generate results subject to such large estimates of uncertainty that the results would be neither reliable nor useful, then we don't have to waste millions of dollars to do it. And I urge support for this amendment. It's what we call a common sense amendment. It simply says, let's don't throw away a lot of money that we don't have.
I was waiting for the word simple, so that's good. Are there other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the CAPS amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Those appear to not have it. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes
Other
no.
members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Whitfield votes no.
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Sullivan votes no.
Ms. Bonomack.
Mrs. Bonomack votes no.
Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Other members? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Oh. Mrs. Christensen?
Mrs. Christensen votes aye.
Mr. Butterfield, are you recorded? He votes aye.
Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 14 ayes, 31 nays.
14 ayes, 31 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. I would note that there are several amendments still to be offered to this bill, so we will recess until 2:05.